Hey friends! Today I'd like to discuss the essential watercolor supplies that you need to create realistic rock, mountain, and seascapes. Every watercolor artist needs paper, paint, brushes, and a water cup. There's so many types of these watercolor supplies that can either be more or less useful depending on your personal goals, preferences, and budget. In this video, I will discuss my favorite supplies as well as why I would choose one supply over another. With that said, these are my personal preferences that work best for me, and there is no right or wrong answer when it comes to art supplies. And I encourage you to choose the supplies that work best for you, given your own personal goals and budget. I hope this video facilitates your watercolor journey by helping you make the most informed decision about what supplies to acquire. And without further ado, let's get into it. Paper is the most important of the three watercolor supplies, and it will have the greatest impact on your paintings. So if you could only spend money on one supply, I definitely recommend to buy the highest quality paper that makes sense for what you are planning to paint. My favorite watercolor paper is Arches rough watercolor paper. I particularly like the rough version due to the extra toothiness of the paper. This extra toothiness is very nice for rocky landscapes because it allows you to get extra rocky texture from using the dry brush technique. Most brands of watercolor paper will have three types, either rough, cold press, or hot press. The main difference is how smooth or textured the paper is. For rocky landscapes, I particularly value the texture and the toothiness, which is why I prefer the rough watercolor paper. And then cold press would be some texture, but a lot smoother than the rough paper. And then hot press will be very smooth. I don't really recommend hot press paper for more rocky landscapes. And different brands will have different amounts of texture, even for these three categories. So for instance, the Arches cold press, in my opinion, is even rougher than something like Saunders Waterford rough. So with that said, I highly recommend something like Arches rough for rocky landscapes, especially when you think you will need to use quite some dry brush to get those really nice textures. So if I'm painting something that requires a lot of blending over larger distances, so something like it would be more common for seascapes, then I tend to use a smoother paper like Arches cold press. But the number one most important thing to consider is to buy 100% cotton paper, especially a thicker cotton paper that's around 140 pounds. The reason for this is the 100% cotton allows for a lot better water absorption and mixing of the paint, and so you can actually get that really nice watercolor blending that watercolor is known for. That's why brands like Arches and Saunders Waterford are so popular among watercolor artists. However, these papers can be quite expensive too. And especially if you're a beginner and you're just starting to practice these techniques, sometimes you don't want to practice on more of the high-end paper. So the other paper I like to use is Stonehenge Aquapress. This is quite a bit cheaper than Arches and Saunders Waterford. When I bought this on Amazon, it's about half the price for the equivalent size of Arches. So you can get a lot of the watercolor practice that I would want and without wasting so much of my expensive paper. The one downside though is you can feel the lower quality of the paper. For instance, if you tape down the sheets, the tape will rip the top layer of paper off, and it also doesn't absorb as much water as Arches or Saunders Waterford. So when I'm painting, I tend to use less water in my mixes, so the technique is a little bit different. But if you're looking for just testing different water or practicing mixing or doing any sort of other technique-based things, I recommend Stonehenge Legion for those types of applications. The other thing though, all 100% cotton is a lot more expensive than other brands that use more wood pulp additives with the cotton. So these papers, they're really bad at handling a lot of water, which is why you don't want to buy them to practice. It's just the typical watercolor techniques will not work as well as 100% cotton paper. But that doesn't mean these papers aren't bad. They can be really useful for things like a sheet of paper to test your water mix to make sure you got the right color. I often use non 100% cotton water paper like this Strathmore watercolor paper to test my watercolor mixes to make sure I got the right color. And because these papers are also flatter, they're really nice for ink and watercolor paintings. So because it's flatter, it's easier to draw on and the ink dries really well on it. You can also paint with watercolor on top of it, but color mixing on the paper is quite challenging. And in general, you want to use a lot less water with your color. Otherwise, the water just sits on top of the surface and moves around. It doesn't absorb into the paper and mix well. I highly recommend buying the highest quality paper that you can, but there's nothing wrong with some of the lower grade versions. Just keep in mind their pros and cons and when is the best time to use them. Watercolor paper typically comes in two forms, either block like this, in which the paper is sealed on all four sides, or loose sheets of paper. Both are nice for different reasons. The block is nice because all the sheets are pre-stretched and the edges are already sealed together, and so there is no extra work that needs to be done before you can start painting. But one of the issues I have is sometimes the sheets still spontaneously pop off, which is what happens here. You can see these extra sheets just delaminated on their own, and so I find I end up needing to tape the blocks anyways. So I've been buying loose sheets of watercolor paper and taping them to these pieces of hardboard that I found online, and I'll link to these in the description down below. My watercolor palette is from Holbein, and it's a metal palette that has an enamel coating on it. It has room for 13 colors, and it has 4 major mixing areas, 3 on the right side and 1 on the left. You can use whatever palette that you like. There isn't any sort of rule or reason why you would use one over another, except for personal preference. I like this palette from Holbein because it has very little dead space. All of the area is functional, and I like how the metal feels in my hands. I've also used plastic palettes in the past. These work great, and I've also even used small plates from the kitchen. But this palette works great for me because it has 13 wells, which is the same number of colors that I consider essential for my style of painting. When it comes to paint, you want to buy the highest quality that fits within your budget. For me personally, I like to use the Winsor-Newton Professional Watercolors. These are great because they have very good mixability. They have very intense colors due to the high pigment ratio, and they also have excellent light fastness. In my palette, I use split primary colors, and this means for each of the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, I will use both a warm and a cool version of that color. I use Permanent Rose as my blue leaning red, and then Scarlet Lake as my yellow leaning red, Winsor Yellow as my red leaning yellow, and then Winsor Lemon as my blue leaning yellow. And then I've got this Winsor Blue green shade as my yellow leaning blue, and then French Ultramarine as my red leaning blue. If you'd like more information on why I like split primaries, please see my free color theory guide in the link in the description. And my color theory guide also includes my favorite color mixing combinations for rockscapes. So again, you can mix any color you want with these 6 primaries. I also recommend having some black colors because since black is made by combining all 3 primaries, they can be a little bit annoying to mix by hand every time. And so I tend to have one warm, one cool, and then a neutral black. So for my warm black, I use Sepia. For my cool black, I'll use Payne's Gray. And then Mars Black is my neutral black. When I set up my palette, I like to put blacks on both ends. And so I'll use my warm blacks next to the reds, and then my cooler neutral blacks closer to the blues. And lastly, I have my earth colors. These are colors that I use all the time for different kinds of rocks and dirt. I have burnt sienna, burnt umber, yellow ochre, sap green. And the sap green is such a versatile color. You can make it a bit lighter green by mixing in some Winsor Lemon. You can make it a darker green by mixing in some Payne's Gray, or even more of an olive green type color by mixing in burnt sienna or sepia. Now let's get into swatching some of these colors. First up is Sepia, which is my warm black. It's a beautiful black with a little bit of brown mixed in. Very nice color. Next up, we've got Permanent Rose. And this is my blue leaning red. And then I have Scarlet Lake. This is my yellow leaning red. Burnt Sienna. Burnt Umber. Yellow Ochre. Winsor Yellow. Winsor Yellow is my red leaning yellow. Winsor Lemon is my blue leaning yellow. Permanent Sap Green. Winsor Blue Green shade. This is my yellow leaning blue. It's also called Phthalo Blue by other brands. French Ultramarine is my red leaning blue. Payne's Gray is my cool black. You can see it's a really dark color with a slightly blue undertone to it. And then last but not least, Mars Black, my more neutral black. And there you have it. These are my 13 colors that I consider essential for rock, mountain, and seascapes. Okay, let's talk about brushes now. I have 5 brushes that I use regularly, 3 from the Princeton Heritage series, and then 2 from the Princeton Aqua Elite series. My 3 Heritage brushes are my go-to bread and butter. I use a number 16 rounds a number 6 round, and a number 2 round. These round brushes are particularly great because they can produce both very large strokes and very narrow strokes with the same brush. And you can also do compound strokes, so going from thick to thin to thick. And this is because of their geometry, where they have a really fine tip but a really fat base. These are very great all-purpose brushes. They can be used for large washes, they can be used for really fine details. Just these 3 brushes go a very long way. One thing I really like about these brushes is that when you are pressing down into the paper, when you lift, they snap back to their original shape. It allows for very good control while you're painting. And this is in contrast to some other brushes I've tried where you press down on the brush and they just keep that shape when you lift. And so then it's harder to do these more compound strokes. My only complaint, if I could be really picky, is that sometimes it feels like the brush runs out of paint quicker than I would like. Especially if I'm painting larger areas, it would be nice to use the same color for a longer period. Then you're going back and forth between the palette more often. My other 2 brushes are from the Princeton Aqua Elite. I have a 1.5 inch modeler brush. This is really great for when I'm painting much larger areas and I need to wet a large sheet of paper. Like sometimes I'll paint on A3 paper, for instance, and this is really good for soaking the whole paper. The other brush I have is this number 8 rigger. I really like this because I can produce really fine brush strokes, and this extra long body means it holds a lot more paint, and so the line can go a lot further than something like my number 2 brush. Both of these series are synthetic brushes, meaning no animals are harmed, and I like that quite a lot. And because they are synthetic, they tend to be on the lower price range than some of the other watercolor brushes, yet they still perform quite well. I think the brush is the least important of the 3 watercolor supplies. You can go Princeton brushes, you could get more like Dollar Tree brushes, and they would still work well for you. The main difference would be how much water the brush holds and then how well it maintains its shape while you're painting. All of these are preferences, just work in your budget. The last supply you need is a water reservoir. Really, this is something that everyone has. You can use any cup you like. You could use a plastic solo cup. You could use a mug that you have lying around. What I use is this ball mason jar that we had just lying around. My wife used to use this for acrylic paint. There's a lot of acrylic still stuck on the sides. It works great for me. I really like these wide mouth jars that are a little bit deep, so you can fill the water a little bit shallow and that prevents splashing. The other reservoir I use is literally a plastic bottle that I bought in Taiwan that I then cut in half. And so I use this whenever I travel, and it works really well. Use whatever supply you have lying around for these water reservoirs. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you found it informative and that it helps you along your watercolor journey. Comment below to let me know what your favorite watercolor supplies are, and let me know if there's something that you think I should try out. I'd especially like to hear your recommendation for thirsty brushes that still have a nice snap. Remember to check out my color theory guide by clicking the link in the description, and also check the description for links to all the supplies I discussed in this video. I hope you have a great rest of your day filled with peace and happiness. See you next time. Bye!